Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to this Kantar Climate Governance Initiative, Director Perspectives from across the globe. How can we achieve, how can we advance climate actions on boards? I'm delighted to be here today with Jonathan Hall from Kantar and our special guests, all of whom are superstar directors from the Climate Governance Initiative's network of chapters. We have Donna Zarconi from the USA, we have Suyan Teo from Malaysia, and we have Felipe Gorczyza from Poland. I'm really excited to speak with them and to find out what they think about how we advance climate action on boards. I'm Alexandra Bolton from the Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm now going to hand you over to Jonathan Hall from Kantar, who's going to talk about the overview of the Global Impact Survey and key learnings that Kantar have just run across the initiative. Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Delighted to be here today to share the headline findings from our work together. So one thing before I start, as I go through the slides, you may want to see them in more detail rather than my talking head, in which case you'll need to click on the Maximize button in the Slides widget, which is the top right of your screen. So if you just move your mouse over that, you'll see how to maximize. Okay, so with that, let's dive in and begin with what we're trying to achieve here. So the focus of today's presentation is very much around the objective of understanding from the perspective of board directors, the status of progress of climate in the boardroom and what they see as the key accelerators and barriers to action. We'll also be covering off briefly how the Climate Governance Initiative Network better supports board directors on their climate journeys. So if that's the what of today's presentation, then this is very briefly the how. Building off pilot work we did with the UK chapter of CGI in 2022, we started with 29 vision interviews across the world. So these are extended, in-depth conversations with directors. And these conversations gave us huge insight in their own right, but also helped shape a structured, quantitative survey questionnaire that we then went on to use with a broader base of 440 directors in 20 countries. Importantly, a diverse base of directors with experience across industry sectors. So there are 7 key findings I want to share with you today over the next 10 minutes, and I'll go through these at some pace. The opening point, as you can see here, is that over 90% of directors believe that despite the fact that boards are operating in an increasingly complex environment, they both have a responsibility to influence the organization's direction on climate action and have it in their gift to do this. It's seen as a responsibility, as duty of care, and the notion of future-proofing the business and commercial resilience were referred to in the interviews repeatedly. And more specifically, company strategy on climate and net zero is the #1 area that board directors feel they have agency when it comes to influencing the board in this space. The second point is that while, of course, compliance is extremely important, it's seen as the primary driver of climate engagement and action by only a minority of directors, 41%, as you see on the right-hand side of the chart. Crucially, almost 9 in 10 directors see the disruption that climate change is causing and will increasingly cause as an opportunity for their business and a driver of innovation. 81% see climate as driving new forms of collaboration and partnerships, and 77% think that it will transform their business model over the longer term. And yet, despite this, there is a perceived strategy action gap. While directors feel they have influence on company strategy on climate and net zero, and while over half feel that their businesses are focused on strategy development in this space, they see less progress on implementation. And by that, they mean everything from product development to stakeholder engagement, to employee training, and on to remuneration and incentivization. And this flows through into and possibly explains the numbers on reporting. So as we can see from this chart, only 40% of board directors fed back that their businesses are currently reporting on progress on climate-related actions. But of course, the actions need to be happening for them to be reported on. That said, more encouragingly, that number of those planning to publish reports is set to rise to 72% within the year. Now we see some variance across the regions, as you see from the chart, but actually it's relatively consistent across the piece. And this is true of transition planning as well as measurement and reporting. As we see here, only a third of businesses have either already published a transition plan or will do so in the next year. If we look at the lower half of this chart then, remarkably, over half of boards, 57%, have no plans to publish a transition plan in the next year. And this is particularly true of smaller companies, those with under 250 employees, and geographically in the US, Brazil, and Romania are the countries we looked at. There is, however, some nuance to this. Over half of those businesses that will not be publishing a plan in the next year have set net zero and climate-related targets, which might suggest the need for more support in the creation of transition plans. And I know the UK chapter of CGI has recently launched a transition planning toolkit. Now, my fifth point out of 7 headlines from the study focuses on barriers to progress. We've observed that 9 in 10 directors feel it's their responsibility to influence the organization's direction on climate action. And a similar proportion see action on climate as an opportunity for the business and a driver of innovation. So why the relative inertia on reporting and transition planning? And what we see is 4 main interrelated barriers. The number 1 barrier, at 46% globally, is that climate action is not being prioritized at board level, with short-term objectives taking precedence. Then comes a concerning lack of knowledge at 40%, both inadequate education on the topic and uncertainty on regulations and standards. Something highlighted by a director in Poland, as you see on the right-hand side of this chart. More education is needed at both the management and supervisory board level. In third place is the lack of financial incentives at 27% globally. And again, I direct you to the comment by the UK, Ned, on the right-hand side of the chart. When people's bottom line, their pay is impacted, then they actually start to listen. The real change will come when CEOs and boards will be judged on whether they are being more sustainable. And finally, lack of appropriate expert governance coming in at 15%. So how is CGI doing in helping board directors drive the agenda? Well, what we see is that local chapters are inspiring action in boardrooms worldwide. And the more engaged directors are with their CGI chapter, the more impact we see in the boardroom. 57% of directors who are highly engaged with their local chapter call out the role of CGI. 55% of directors globally specify CGI's role in improving their knowledge on climate, rising to as high as 92% in Malaysia. CGI chapters are a trusted source of up-to-date knowledge on policy and regulation, as well as inspiration with regard to business opportunities and peer-to-peer support. And specifically, networking, thought leadership, and events are highly valued by some 3/4 of directors worldwide. A remarkable 73% of board directors in Asia Pacific say their local chapter's tools and resources have made them more confident in boardroom discussions. And the final point I'd like to leave you with is that 9 out of 10 board directors feel strongly that climate demands a mindset shift. New forms of thinking and leadership from the boardroom, the executive, and indeed the workforce. Only 1/3 of boards currently classify climate action as high priority. And the mindset shift that directors believe is required is summed up by the director here from Canada, top right of the chart. It's about changing the conversation from risk to opportunity. But thank you for listening. Needless to say, I'm just the spokesperson today for a team of people at CGI and Kantar. Please do reach out to us with any questions after the fact. And now, as I've finished with the slides, please do click the minimize button top right in the slides widget so you will be able to see the speakers. And with that, I'll hand back to Alexandra.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you so much. That was great to see those figures again and to understand more about how the work of the Climate Governance Initiative is helping boards and individual board members really take climate action. We're fantastically lucky here that we have, as I say, we have our 3 amazing guests. The next section is going to be a conversation and some questions, but please, for those of you out there listening in, there is a Q&A section on this chat where you can put your questions in, and there will be 15 minutes at the end where we will be taking questions and passing them to the panel. So please feel free to add your questions as we're speaking. Don't wait till the end, otherwise we might miss some really exciting ones. And the other heads up is there's going to be a poll from Su-Yin, and you will have 30 seconds to click on your choice of options. So it's coming up, get ready. Donna, Su-Yin, Philippe, thank you so much for being here and giving your time at various times of the day for you all to be on this webinar. You and your chapters are doing some really incredible work, and I'd like to find out a little bit more, if I may. And I'm going to start with Su-Yin. Having listened to the presentation from Jonathan, which of those findings most resonated with you?
Hi, Alexandra. Thank you so much for having me. I have to say, when I was looking through Jonathan's slides, there was one on page 8 and page 9. The data points there were slightly worrying, and that is the sort of what I thought would have been higher numbers in terms of willingness to or ability to report, climate data. And I suspect that part of that is whether it's confidence or skill sets or resources, I'm not entirely sure, but a lot of the findings do point towards prioritizing and skill sets. And this is where I think it'll be quite useful to kick things off, to pop the question on, to get our poll going. So if everyone could just, sort of tell us about whether your board has the right skill sets to prioritize climate action or not. And I think we all tend to be a little bit polite, but please feel free to be absolutely candid, because what the data points are telling us doesn't quite tally with sort of conversations we've been having informally. Okay, how are we getting on? So 30 seconds. While we're getting the results for that, I just thought it was quite useful to talk about prioritization. It's a common moan among board members that we have way too much on the agenda, and sustainability issues crop up if they do at the end. This is generalization, of course, but I'll be also interested to hear from others on this panel, how have we moved that up the priority chain? One of the things I've looked at is making sure the chairman puts that as the first 2 items on the agenda. So here we go. This is this is not a great number, really, is it, in terms of the split? It says, well, almost 2/3 have said, actually, we don't have the right skill set. So actually, Jonathan, that might explain some of the data points. And it's interesting, you're not going to get this in a board meeting, and you're not going to get this in conversations. So deep down inside, for most boards, confidence is a little bit on the low side. So I'll stop there before I sort of carry on. But that's a very interesting two sets of numbers there. Thank you.
It is, and thank you, Sien. Donna, I wonder were you surprised by these numbers on the poll? Is that what you see in your broader experience? I'm not talking specifically within your companies, but more broadly within the director community. Does this feel about right for the boards that you come into contact with?
Yeah, I would say I just want to add to what Sue has mentioned, in that if I look at my two public boards, and I went back in preparation for this discussion and looked at the reports that they did 3 to 4 years ago versus the report that they did this last year, they are significantly different, much more robust and more informative, and much more strategic. But it's been quite a journey, and it's been a very steep learning curve. Mm-hmm. And I think to your point is that knowledge and that confidence is part of the factor. The prioritization piece, though, that Sue mentioned, I think is also equally critical, because when I've seen the CEOs lean in and now, in fact, have put in place not only their support, but the board support, they've put in place leaders who are absolutely passionate about pushing this initiative forward. And they have created cross-functional teams to drive it within the organization. Then the knowledge increases and the prioritization increases. And it really becomes effective in terms of driving a plan that can be implemented and climate action that can be taken.
Thank you. And Philippe, to go back to the poll, do these figures were you expecting to see this? Were you expecting to see a different split?
Yeah, I don't know whether this is, so first of all, hello everyone. And I don't know whether this is what I expected, but it somehow supports the way I look at the topic and various surveys and polls. So firstly, I personally believe that in most surveys on ESG and climate in particular, there is always a valid question about the reliability of the answers provided. So whether board members asked about their commitment and actions indeed provide honest answers. So it's not that they are trying to lie or paint a totally different picture, but it's because those questions those topics are tied to values and questions of morality, then maybe they want to see something a bit different when they look into the mirror than the true objective picture of reality. Yeah? So there is always, and actually, if you look at the results of the survey, there is one good example of that seems to support my doubts when it comes to the. Actually two of the answers provided, the 2 points. So first, how does your board currently approach climate action? And then, and there is, if you see, there is a low rank of financial planning answer and incentives and remuneration. Yeah, so from my perspective, and maybe I'm biased, being mostly a financially oriented professional, but both of those topics seem to me to be critical if you want to achieve meaningful change. Yeah, so this low rank of those financial planning and incentives and remuneration answers casts some doubt, in my opinion, on some of the other items on the list which rank higher. In particular, for example, the top one, strategy and business model. Yeah, because how can you approach strategy and business model without financial planning and incentives and remuneration in place? Yeah, so that's the first point I'd like to raise. Secondly, about the seemingly very positive point on that the overwhelming majority of board directors, 86%, perceive climate as an opportunity for their business. Yeah? Of course, that seems, to be the right way also to approach the topic. And I personally, I try to convince many people to approach this topic from this perspective. However, this is the easy path. Yeah, and there is always the question whether this path will indeed lead us to net zero, whether this is enough, because of course, every change creates opportunities, but whether this is enough to have this approach as a business, I struggle to believe that. Yeah, so the businesses need to do more if we are to achieve those objectives than just look for the opportunities for their business. Yeah, if so, then probably maybe even our whole initiative would not be needed that much. Yeah. So that was what I. Yeah. That was like my first thoughts when I looked at the survey results.
Thank you, Felipe. Actually, I would like to go to Donna, because that 86% believe that climate represents an opportunity for innovation for business, I felt was a very encouraging statistic, but completely take your point, Felipe, that it also needs not to just be an opportunity, it needs to create the results, the outcomes that we want. But I also saw the statistic that was saying that 70% of directors see that this is transforming their company's long-term business model. And Donna, I wonder if you have an example you could share around how one changes the conversation in boardrooms, moving from risk to opportunity. Of course, while keeping an eye on the risk as well, that's important, we know that. But I wonder if you had any examples there.
So I'm happy to share an example in one of the boards I work with, which is a technology company, and they are a technology partner and distributor. And we started asking a lot more questions in the boardroom with regards to what is the plan and the path that they're taking. When they started to go through and realize that there is an opportunity because of the significant value chain that is involved with distribution, they became a leader in not only changing their company, but changing others within the supply chain. And to give you an example, they do an annual partner summit where they have all their partners, which are all the vendors that they buy equipment from. And think of this as a room full of competitors because they sell multiple different brands of technology. And in the last few years at their partner summit, they have been on stage talking about the work that they are doing with regards to environmental and logistical issues. And as a result, they've now become a convener of the competitors to talk about how can they all work together to get costs out of the supply chain. And the results have emerged that they are the thought leader. They are becoming more of a trusted partner within the supply chain. And they have seen increased efficiencies in the supply chain, better device recycling, and lower energy consumption. And overall, a much more efficient operations and lower carbon footprint. So this is an opportunity to not only lean in, but take a leadership role.
That's great to hear, Donna. Thank you. And I'm particularly keen to sort of talk about how everything is interconnected. So getting all those people in the room, competitors as well, allows us to solve these, or start to solve some of these issues, because it's about systems of systems that are connected rather than just one particular piece of the supply chain. So that's fantastic to hear.
That's exactly it. And it's and when you have competitors who are in the same situation in terms of trying to figure out how to solve this problem and how to really put through an effective transition plan, that information sharing is very powerful.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I'd like to come to you and just ask whether, have you seen anything on your boards or in the wider region that shows that companies are moving from looking just at risk to looking at the opportunities as well? Is that something you're seeing in your region too?
Oh, absolutely. Though it's been a bit of a slow start compared to maybe Europe. A little interesting snippet here. As you probably know, the palm oil industry in Asia has come under tremendous amount of scrutiny from various angles, from workers' conditions at work to, sort of impact on the environment, etc., deforestation. So because of, just having to report numbers today where they didn't have to 10 years ago, they've been forced or backed into a corner to think about different ways of being innovative. So as Philippe said, there is this innovation side that's kicked in, which is wonderful. So imagine trying to keep an eye on hundreds and thousands of acres around Indonesia or Southeast Asia. So they've used drones. They've been forced to use drones to not just help them scan, but pick up data, help them to deliver materials, lower costs. So as you can imagine, what was an incredibly manual job has actually been part automated thanks to pressures from, sort of climate action initiatives. So I think this is a real opportunity, but that's come from being backed into a corner. So there's good things that's coming out of this, what I think a huge sort of initiative.
Thank you. And it's really interesting that change happened, as you say, because they were backed into a corner rather than from, a different, maybe more positive outcome. I want to do it, but really interesting to see that obviously it saves money, it cuts costs, which is also a really good, sound commercial practice.
Yeah. I don't think all the plantation companies will agree with what I've just said, but I do think it forces change from particularly what I would call the traditional industries where there's not been much change beyond the obvious.
And that sort of brings me, and I'm going to come to Philippe on this one, because it links with what you were saying about incentives. How do we incentivize the boards to actively take those type of changes in strategy and ways of working that both Don and Soo have described? How do we also mitigate the risk of unintended negative effects when we're doing things that will create financial incentives to encourage boards to adopt these kind of sustainable business practices? I wondered if you had any thoughts around that.
Yeah, so actually in the region from which I come from, so in particular Poland, but Central and Eastern Europe, I don't think this is actually the main perspective you need to look at at this topic, because our public market is quite specific. Most companies are actually small and medium-sized companies, if you would look at them from the global angle. Also, quite a large number of them, those are companies that are controlled by one shareholder, who is an entrepreneur, and at the same time, this person acts as the CEO. Yeah, so this is, the proportion is quite different to many other markets. Because of that, and because you have the two-tier board system, then actually the same CEO, also his or her votes, mostly those are his votes, they actually decide on who sits on the supervisory board, which in theory is at the level above him. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to convincing the CEO, who is this, controlling shareholder, to take action. And, so this is the right perspective, because you cannot impose any incentives, or, that's not what will be effective here. Yeah. So, and how then we come to the topic of how to talk to different people and how to talk to entrepreneurs. Of course, you need to show the opportunity, but also the pressure from the market, so from the clients, the customers, from the employees and potential employees who need to be recruited, how they view this topic, especially the younger generation who now constitute the majority of the workforce. Yeah? So people who are Gen Z or even millennials, for them, climate is a very important topic, and you can show survey results even from Poland, where it's very clear that those people who are both the customers, the main customer group, and the employee group, they expect meaningful actions to be taken. The same goes naturally in terms of financing, the financial institutions and other organizations, and this value chain discussion. And if you talk through this lens, certainly you can convince this the CEO, the private entrepreneur, and that's probably the only way to approach this topic. So and coming back to your question, so basically, in terms of those incentives in our region, this is mostly quite a limited group of large companies that have either dispersed shareholding, maybe controlled by the government, but there you actually don't need to incentivize a lot, because those companies do much more than the rest. So then it's actually quite difficult to pressure them to do even more, because there is a huge gap between those companies and, again, this majority of smaller entities.
Thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about the chapters. As you know, the Climate Governance Initiative is a network of amazing chapters in various different locations, and we have here the USA, Poland, and Malaysia. Donna, I'd like to come to you and just sort of ask how your local chapter and the CGI network, in what ways has that been useful, and how have you found that supported the adoption of climate action in the boardroom?
So I'm happy to speak to that, because I think it's been very important. And what we saw in the survey discussion with regards to knowledge is, just as the corporate staff is rapidly upskilling in their areas of climate risk and understanding and reporting, so must directors. We have to be upskilling and learning as well, so that we can be asking the right questions. And through CGI and my local NACD chapter, I'm learning from my peers about their relative experience, the relationships that they're building, the experts that they've brought to the table to give us a better understanding of key issues. And there's a wonderful repository of information and timely articles that I can access, which to me is very helpful when I'm trying to sort through the alphabet soup of ruling bodies and conflicting regulations and reporting requirements. And I just want to do a quick shout out to you and to CGI. I took the 30-minute board tutorial program on your website. And for everyone that's listening, I would highly recommend it. It's got great visuals, and it's a really helpful overview on climate science, policies and processes, the disclosure landscape, and effective board governance. And I'll tell you that the information has been very important to me, because it's helped me ask better questions, more informed questions. And as a director, I want to also be able to bring in an outside-in point of view, and I'm getting that. And one last point that I thought would be helpful in this conversation is that I attended a meeting last year of institutional investors, and it was institutional investors meeting along with corporate directors to talk about really an idea and exchange related to corporate governance issues. And the institutional investors in the room were asking the directors about upskilling and how the directors are undertaking their own path to be more knowledgeable in addressing climate risk issues and opportunities, as well as cyber and other timely topics. And the investors were asking, how can we determine that such upskilling is actually happening? And I think by demonstrating the engagement with our local chapters and with CGI overall, that's a great way to be able to show that we are continuously learning on this topic.
That's wonderful. And I love the idea of lifelong learning on any topic. And thank you so much for the shout out for the Foundations course on the CGI website. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome. It's quite good.
I've done it. I loved it, actually.
Yeah.
So, I'd be really interested, Malaysia is another one of our stunning chapters doing incredible work, Is it the same things that you're finding useful from the Malaysian chapter, or are there other things also that you find more useful, differently useful perhaps?
Yeah, Alexandra, you've got absolutely wonderful colleagues in this part of the world. They do a fabulous job. And, you know, they do all the stuff that you expect, which is exactly what Donna said. But what we found, I'm not directly involved with them, but I've worked with them before. And the thing I found most useful is stakeholder engagement. And that being involved in sort of not lobbying, but negotiating with the government on a number of policies, on climate policies, having credibility from your colleagues and the content behind that, it's a huge impact. So there is, you know, a lot of governments, I think, whilst they are all waving this climate change flag, many of them, like all of us, they don't have sufficient resources, skill sets. So the more the merrier in terms of helping, whether it's communities or government agencies. So that's been extremely useful in Malaysia, is having that content, that sort of knowledge to support some of these climate policies that the country desperately needs.
Thank you, and that's really good to hear. That I agree with you entirely. That when we work together, the more of us that work together, the more that dial can move, the more we can get that dial to move, which is obviously what we all want. Philippe, I wonder whether you know, we've got three very different types of jurisdictions, if you like. Do you see the same things within the chapter in Poland, which, you know, again is doing great work? What sort of things are you finding useful from the Polish chapter?
Yes, I mean, all the things that were mentioned, certainly they also apply to Poland, and the colleagues here are doing a great job, and you know, more and more people are joining. So there certainly is quite a considerable effect that the chapter has had on board directors, especially, well, the non-executive directors in particular, because as I said, we have this two-tier board system in Poland. So everything is more focused in terms of chapter 0, more on the non-executives, yeah, so supervisory board members. So it's doing a great job. I think that from my experience, when, you know, mostly from the working with the Polish organization, but also with some other, I believe, like, if you would ask me about the challenges or things that need to be considered for the future, is I guess the next stage should be about tailoring the communication to different groups, much more so than in the past, yeah, because otherwise what we can see is that there seems to, you know, there is a bubble which is growing, but it's still a bubble where those are people from the financial sector, you know, executives, non-executives, and they basically are aware of the challenges, and they are mostly supporting all the topics, but actually, you know, they are not necessarily the ultimate decision makers, as I mentioned, because, you know, those many companies are those entrepreneurs, founders, and, you know, it's quite important to go beyond this group with the communication to other groups, yeah, and this communication, obviously, to each and every group needs to be very different, focusing on different topics, structured differently, and so on. So I believe this is something that in the next stage of development of the entire initiative is something which is relevant. I'm, you know, certainly for Poland, but I'm quite sure that for other chapters as well.
Wonderful, thank you. One of the things we saw, actually, I'll stop and say to everybody who's listening, please, the Q&A is open. Please put in some any questions that you might have. We'll be coming to questions in about 5 minutes. There are some up there, but it would be great to have some more. One of the things that we saw from the wonderful Kantar survey is that lack of prioritization of climate is one of the big barriers. And that made me think about, quite often you have a management champion of climate change. I'd really like to sort of hear your views on the importance of having a board champion for the climate change agenda, for climate action. And hear what you all are. I'll be coming to all of you with this question, but I'll start with Donna first, if that's okay.
I'm happy to answer this, especially as a relatively new grandmother with 3 grandchildren, 3, 1, and 2 months old.
Wow.
I am a champion. And I'll just mention that in addition to my corporate boards, I also serve on the national board of the Smithsonian Institution. And most people think of the Smithsonian as the museums on the mall in Washington, D.C., but they actually have over 500 scientists and researchers around the world, many of whom are focused on climate change. And in particular, I just want to share a story because it does come back to the tie-in to why it's so important to me on the corporate side. The Smithsonian has a Tropical Research Institute, which is located in Panama, and it's leading a global study called the GeoTrees Project on the effects of climate change in tropical forests. And what they're looking for is the amount of carbon capture that the tropical forests provide. And why is it relevant to corporations and how does it come into the discussion in the boardroom? They are quantifying the carbon capture using scientific methods to determine how to best structure carbon offsets that corporations can use to actually meet their short-term goals, climate goals, while the corporations continue to invest in their climate action plans to reduce direct emissions. And while I know that there's been some heated discussions of late on carbon offsets, we do have to go through a transition. And there is great benefit to using a scientific measure to better understand effective carbon offsets because it's been not a very scientifically driven area. And it's really, if we do this right, we'll be better at preserving the carbon sink that the tropics provide. And so I'm very committed to driving this change both at the nonprofit level and at the corporate level, because we need to do both and much more to address climate change. And, if I were to flip my screen around here, you would see a beautiful ocean view. But 18 months ago, this area that I'm sitting in was devastated by Hurricane Ian. And so seeing the impact of a 15-foot storm surge and how it does change and adds a significantly increased risk to an area, I have a strong sense of urgency. And I know that we all together need to work. And the board's role in leadership is critical in driving this climate action. So that's why I'm a champion. And I do think that when I come into the boardroom, they know I'm going to be asking those questions. And so it does create a different sense of preparedness from the management's perspective as well.
And it's wonderful to hear such strong championship coming from you, Donna. Thank you for all you're doing. And I always like to quote the Antonio Guterres of cooperate or perish. We need to work together. We have to work together to solve this. It's not something we can just sort of do in our own little rooms, houses, teams, whatever it is. We need to cooperate. It's incredibly important.
I think so too. I think corporations are really good at, once they get a plan and they get an action plan together, they're very good at executing on that plan. And that's what I think institutional investors are expecting from our corporations, is to show that you have a plan and how you're going to execute on that plan to drive long-term sustainable value.
I agree. So, I'd like to sort of hear your perspective from your boards about having that climate champion on the board. How important is it, and what a difference does it make?
No, it's in fact, I think we need champions with an S, or chief naggers, as I call them, because I think every board you do need naggers, and you need them at committees as well. And really, board members are only useful if they are, as we said earlier, knowledgeable, and being able to make that impact on the board. You need to be convinced as well yourself. And a lot of the hard work, and I'm sure you see this in, Philippe, you've seen this in the bank that you were involved with, coming from the banking side as well, because there's so many things that need to be done on a regulatory basis. Unless you make it a priority committee and not part of another committee, a standalone which reports into the board, and one that the CEO himself or herself sits on as well, that's one way of making sure that the message gets sent right through and is executed. I love, Donna, what you talked about, in terms of your involvement, outside of what I call your other day jobs. I've had the absolute privilege of, still am, on the board of WWF Malaysia. So like you, Donna, I've been incredibly lucky that a lot of my knowledge has actually come from there, from a climate perspective, because they do pro bono work for companies, small or big, on climate policies. So I think just to look at it from a different perspective, Alexandra, when we talked about skill sets and having enough skill sets, actually sitting on an NGO or another board that offers these sort of skill sets would actually add sort of meat to everything that you have in terms of, ability to contribute. So I think, yes, definitely have champions, not just a champion, to get yourself involved in other boards, whether they're NGOs or non-NGOs, and you will actually learn or be forced to learn. And finally, as well, is to simply just to communicate and make sure your voice is heard on the board. And it has to be done through, working committees that feed up.
I love the idea of have champions plural and almost a champion board committee to feed into the board is the more, as you say, the more champions we have in whatever form, the better. Philippe, we've got some great questions from the audience. I wonder if I could ask one of these to you. One of the questions is, how can boards think more long term? Because we know a lot of this transformation will take time, and it will take longer than the typical tenure of a board or an individual board member. Have you faced this challenge, and have you got any top tips for other directors about how to overcome them?
Sure. So maybe first, quickly on this previous question, let me maybe also provide my answer. It will be very short. I fully believe. Well, it can be a champion as long as so one person, as long as this individual has a dominant position. So, for example, controls the company. I'm on the board of one company where when you can say, I guess it would not be an overstatement, that in some way the controlling shareholder and the CEO is actually a champion of this topic. And there is nothing more than the board needs to do, at least the non-executive part of the board, because you can be sure, and this is how it works, that everything will get done and will go in the right direction. Yeah. However, you are talking about other individuals, I fully agree. Those need to be champions. One person is usually not enough. This can even backfire, even be counterproductive, because then this person might get even isolated, and actually those ideas and suggestions can be perceived in a wrong way. So certainly then you need a more in terms of critical mass, even if not the majority, at least a significant part of the board needs to act as champions, and then they can try to persuade the rest of the board and the company to take meaningful action. Now, in terms of this question, I certainly, to some extent, whether I have faced in practice, maybe to some extent, but to be honest, most, especially the larger companies, the boards I sit on, shame to say, I don't think we have that many, as we should, at least in my opinion, discussions about the really long-term perspective. Yeah, I try to impose that in some way, and talking about strategy that we don't go 3 years from now, but 10 years from now. However, my experience is that the last few years have not helped to support such discussions, because we have had so many unexpected changes and developments that people are struggling to see the benefits of going too long in their vision, in their perspective, because you don't know what will happen in a few months, let alone, or even 1 or 2 years from now, let alone 10 years. Yeah, so I try to encourage that, talking about in general, the trends that we need to take some bets, yeah, even if those are just bets, in terms of this 10-year perspective, and then that's also then an opportunity to address the climate topic in some way. Yeah, but other than that, like, I mean, in isolation, I believe it's very difficult to talk about this topic if you don't talk about the strategy in the same time horizon.
That makes perfect sense, Philippe. Thank you, and apologies for not getting the champion question to you. Entirely my fault. Apologies again. Donna or Suyin, I don't know if you had anything to add to that thought around the long-term versus short-term challenge of boards.
Well, I think, as Philippe was saying, that sometimes you put too far out a goal and it's difficult to see how you're going to accomplish it. And so I think what I'm interested in is, yes, let's set that longer term goal, but I really want to see the game plan to execute on that strategy. So what are we doing now, the next year, the next 3-5 years, to make some meaningful progress on achievement of the shorter term goals? Because I do believe that as you set up those shorter term goals, ultimately you move along the path with that game plan to be able to achieve your overall objectives. So kind of bite-sized chunks, let's see what we can get on early wins and how we can make that impact, and then continue to make progress.
Thank you. So, Ian, I don't know if you had any thoughts to add there.
I think I'll just leave a thought. I don't think there's an answer today for it, and that is, it is an investment, and with all investments, it does cost, be it financially, in budgets or headcount or resources. And I think board members we must support and question senior management and say, have you got the resources? Have you adjusted your budgets correctly? Have you really thought about how much it's going to cost? Because you can't expect the right outputs when you've not invested. And I think this is the flaw in this climate crusade that we're all on, or trying to be on, is that, it's a bit like asking a company, to produce X, Y, and Z without actually supporting an investment. And I think board members should go back and think about, yes, we're asking a lot out of the company, but have we truly invested? Not just skill sets. Have we got the right processes in place? I'm sure we all know, just to calculate your carbon footprint, the amount of data that's generated and where you have to go and dig for numbers, it's timely. And do we have the bodies to do that? So I think we have to be fair to management. We have to make sure they've looked at their budgets correctly, and we've got to give them targets that are realistic over a period of time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Alexandra, I'd like to add to something that Philippe said earlier with regards to the next generation that's coming into the workforce, and using them to drive these changes as well. Because when we started working through plans and put teams together, there was such a keen interest in the kind of, like I would say, the younger members of our workforce to be part of it and to be innovators. And they had very creative ideas on how to get at some of this problem solving. So I think that there are champions within the organization that can help and drive these investments and changes, and in an innovative way.
Thank you. That's really interesting to hear. I'm conscious we're getting towards the end of our time, so there's one question in the chat which I'm going to throw at Jonathan in a minute. But while he's answering that, I would like everybody, all four of you, to think about one key takeaway that you'd like board directors to, the one thing you'd like them to start. Let's start that again. The one key takeaway that you would give to board directors, what they can do to start their climate journey. So I'll come back to you all with that. But Jonathan, the question in the chat that sort of feels like perhaps it's very much sort of a you question is about how organizations can get better at translating knowledge into impact to achieve this successful transition to the net zero sustainable development world that we all want to see. In your experience, how do you see that driving from through to impact, from knowledge through to impact?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what we would observe within our clients is that it's just, comes back to the efficient operationalization of knowledge within the business, and of course links into things like measurement and reporting. So I suppose some of the most successful corporates that we work with, take that knowledge and shoot it through everything that the business does, but then make sure that they're measuring that on an ongoing basis with very specific concrete commitments and individual owners to the actions that are coming out, and then publicly talk about those commitments and make sure that they are held to account.
Thank you. Wonderful. Well, I'm going to ask everybody that question that I promised. So I'll start with Soo Yin. The one takeaway that you'd like to give to board directors.
The involvement of what is traditionally called the HR department. It sounds very old-fashioned, but I was pleasantly surprised when we got HR involved in sustainability. In fact, the person who ran HR also ran sustainability. And it actually built a very powerful culture, because I think we do need the right culture to ensure the climate action strategies in any organization permeates through every employee. It's not going to work if it's just sort of the chief nagger on the board or the CEO cracking his or her whip. It's got to be the whole organization, and to do that, the people part of it is super, super important. And if you get that right, I think that would make targets significantly easier.
Thank you. Philippe, may I come to you with the same question, please?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, I guess I would encourage all board members to appreciate that their actions are not limited only to board meetings and the role of a board member, but also communicating externally. Yes, a role that's an important role that you have, especially in large organizations. And at the end of the day, I believe actually the main group, the main groups that can enforce or impact climate are the customers and employees. Yeah, because if they are then pressuring the companies, so we need to use our roles to also communicate with the entire society, rather than just think about actions at the board level. But in terms of all of those actions, what I would encourage everyone to do, as I mentioned before, is to always think about tailoring the communication to a particular addressee. Yeah, so it's very different talking to someone in Sweden and in China, for example, or in Russia. It's very different if you talk to an entrepreneur or to an independent director. Yeah, so it's if you don't tailor your communication, it can be even counterproductive. So it's very important to do that.
Thank you. Donna, I'm going to come to you next, please.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of wrap us up by saying that our responsibility as board members are to be representing our investor community and our multiple stakeholders. And what's being asked of us is to make sure that the corporations are not just creating interesting disclosures and reports, but actually creating a credible net zero transition plan to drive positive change and to assure long-term value creation. So it's, think of it as our charter to ask those questions and make sure that we are in fact driving that so that we can be those agents of change.
Thank you. And Jonathan, I'll come to you. Have you had one thing to pass on?
Sure. Well, notwithstanding all of the incredibly hard work that goes on and needs to go on in the future around scopes 1 and 2, and particularly obviously scope 3, I think the key signal from this study is that 9 in 10 directors see the transition as an opportunity and a driver of innovation. And I think, be that the operational efficiencies that Donna was talking about, it could be due to regulatory pressure, it could be, the proactive identification of new circular business models. I think shifting the conversation beyond compliance and risk to opportunity, we heard is critical to triggering the required mindset shift in the boardroom.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you all very much. Sadly, we're at time. I'd love to stay and chat for at least another hour. Donna, Suyun, Philippe, Jonathan, thank you so much for your insights, for all your hard work, and for everything that you're doing to make a difference. Thank you very much, everybody who came to listen. And if anybody wants to get involved in one of your local chapters, please come to the Climate Governance Initiative chat website, and you'll find all the information there. Thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.